Hi everyone. In today's lesson, we'll be looking at the written sources of Pompeii and Herculaneum. We have the archaeological sources, but there's also many written sources which we can use to learn about Pompeii and Herculaneum. Written sources are very important for the study of Pompeii and Herculaneum. We have eyewitness accounts of the volcanic eruption, and Pliny the Younger wrote about what happened. This is an extraordinary piece of written evidence we can use to study Pompeii and the volcanic eruption. We actually have a person called Pliny the Younger who was there, and he was in a safe place observing the eruption. Pliny was actually in the city of Misenum, so he wasn't trapped in Pompeii and he didn't get killed. He was in a safe place, but he had a very clear view of all that was happening in Pompeii. He could see Mount Vesuvius erupting, he could see something coming out of the mountain, and he wrote about it. So this is an extraordinary eyewitness account of one of the most catastrophic events in history. There are also many other written sources that tell us about Pompeii and Herculaneum, such as inscriptions, labels on wine jars. Just the fact they had labels on wine jars, I think, is interesting. I mean, you can go to the store today and have a wine jar and it's got a label on it, but even back in those days they had labels, which I think is amazing. And there's also thousands of messages written on the walls, including advertisements, political slogans, and graffiti. So even back in those days, they had a political system, they had elections, and people would write slogans on the walls, like vote for this person or vote for that person. And they had graffiti. Today, many people will complain about graffiti. If there's graffiti on a building or on a train or something like that, many people complain. And they criticize young people. They say, what's the world coming to? Look at all this graffiti. Young people have got no respect. But even 2,000 years ago in Pompeii, they had graffiti. And none of us would say that's a bad thing in Pompeii because it tells us something about the city. We can learn about Pompeii from their graffiti. When we look at history, there are primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are those that come from the time we are studying. For example, a letter, a speech, or an eyewitness account. Secondary sources are sources that come after the time we are studying. For example, a movie about Pompeii made now is a secondary source. And you might be surprised to know this, but they actually did make a movie about Pompeii. It came out in the year 2014, this year, so it wasn't too long ago. And you can go and watch that movie. I think it would be on DVD now, or it might come out on DVD soon. I don't think it's at the cinema anymore. But you can go and watch that film. But just remember, that film is a secondary source. It's not video camera footage that was taken at the time of the eruption. It's a movie made 2,000 years after the event. But nevertheless, it would be very interesting to watch. The picture on the left-hand side of the screen is a secondary source. Now, this is a very good picture. You can see Mount Vesuvius and this massive eruption of volcanic material. And this would have been going on for 18 hours. You have the city down here, all these beautiful buildings, well-paved streets, all these people not really sure what's happening. They didn't know that it was a volcano. They don't really know what a volcano is. They weren't sure what was going on. But you can clearly see in this picture what the people of Pompeii would have been looking at 2,000 years ago. But you've got to understand this is not a photograph, it's just a modern day picture. So that makes it a secondary source. So it might look like a photo. I think it looks like a photo, but it's just a modern day image. There are also ancient writers who wrote about Pompeii and Herculaneum. Many ancient societies used writing extensively. They mostly wrote on papyrus, clay tablets, parchment, and wooden tablets. Some of the ancient writers who made reference to Campania, Pompeii, and Herculaneum are listed. Cassius Dio, he was an ancient writer who made reference to one of them in his writing of the history of Rome. Tacitus, it was actually Pliny the Younger who wrote a letter to Tacitus explaining to him what happened when he saw the volcanic eruption. There's also Florus, Livy, who wrote a history of Rome, Appian, who wrote the civil wars, and Vallius Paterculus, who wrote his own book, The Histories. So these are some of the historians that may have mentioned Campania, Pompeii, or Herculaneum in their writings. The most important ancient historian we will study in regards to Pompeii is Pliny the Younger. He was alive at the time of the eruption. He actually witnessed the eruption and wrote a detailed account of what happened. Pliny the Younger had an uncle named Pliny the Elder. So don't get the two confused. Just remember there are two of them. There's Pliny the Younger and his uncle, Pliny the Elder. Pliny the Younger was about 18 years old when Mount Vesuvius erupted. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, was admiral of the fleet based in Misenum. Now, in this picture, we can see Mount Vesuvius is here, and we can see Herculaneum is here, and Pompeii is around here. Now, over here is Misenum. This is Misenum. This is where Pliny the Younger and Pliny the Elder were located. So you can see they're a very safe distance from the volcano, but they also have a very good view of what was going on. And unfortunately, Pliny the Elder actually travelled to Stabii to try to get a better look of what was going on and try to rescue survivors. And he ended up getting killed himself. But Pliny wrote an account of what he saw. Pliny stayed in Misenum and he wrote an account of what he saw. No one in ancient Rome actually knew what a volcano was. The ancient Romans spoke the language of Latin, and the word volcano did not exist in the Latin language. So they saw this mountain just sort of exploding. They just saw these things coming out of the mountain. They weren't really sure what it was. But they could obviously tell it was something very serious, it was something very bad. Pliny described the eruption, which lasted for over 18 hours. And remember, his uncle went out as the admiral of the fleet and tried to find out what was going on, tried to rescue survivors. His uncle actually got out of the boat and went ashore, and he apparently just dropped dead. And the accounts say that his body had no marks on it. So he didn't get hit in the head with a rock or anything like that. His body had no marks. He just dropped dead. He must have breathed in some poisonous gas from a volcano, and he died. But thankfully, Pliny was safe in Misenum. He observed what happened, and he wrote about it. And so we have this wonderful written source to know what happened. The type of eruption he saw is now called a Plinian eruption. So this type of volcanic eruption is now named after him. Pliny's uncle, Pliny the Elder, went on the ship to investigate, but he wasn't able to make it back alive. He got killed when he went ashore. And of course he was killed by the poisonous gas, and this helps us understand also how others would have been killed at the time. Pliny's account of the eruption is the best source we have for what happened. You've got to understand, this is a time when there's no TV, there's no video cameras, there's no still cameras, there's no internet. All we have is what this man, Pliny, is observing. Pliny later became a politician, a lawyer, a judge, and author. Pliny wrote 2 letters to the historian Tacitus describing in detail what happened, and we have those letters. You should know Pliny and his writings very well because you'll probably come across them in your studies. And if you haven't come across them already, you should investigate them. You should go and read them because they're a very important written source. And that's what this presentation was about. It's all about the written sources of Pompeii.